Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's podcast. It's Thursday, December 3rd. We haven't been on the air for the past few months, but it's good to be back. We're still on our YouTube account. When we finished, we had worked out a lot of the kinks, but there'll probably be some new ones as we get going, and we'll attend to those as we get to them. It's nice, nice and cold and rainy winter evening in Bangor, and it's for evenings like this that the over-the-web adult education was really conceived of, that we can all stay in the comforts of our home and still do a little bit of learning together. So happy to see you. This is configured for questions. If you wish to type them in, I'll check it periodically. And then at the end, I'll also go back and see if there's any concerns or any issues that you want me to address. Having said that, let's dive right into it. We're going to talk about something very interesting tonight, the Book of Judith. Many of you may have not even heard of this book, and may not realize that it has something to do with the holiday of Hanukkah, which is coming up in a couple of nights. But even beyond that, I think we're going to learn that there's quite a bit to this book that did not quite make it into our Bible. Before we go ahead, I want to start with a little bit of a plea. Please, if you're on Facebook, please like my Facebook page. You'll get first shot at any articles I write, and you'll be able to tune directly into these podcasts. My goal is to catch up with Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, America's rabbi, in terms of number of likes. He is currently at 600,000, so I have my work cut out for me. But it's important not to fall further behind. So please like the page. If you do, I can guarantee you'll be a ben olam haba. You'll have a share in the world to come. The Book of Judith, as you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I've been through the Bible. I've never seen this book. I've never heard of this book. It's in a collection, and we'll return to this question later in the lecture. It's one of the so-called canonical books. That means that it's not quite in, and it's not quite out. And we'll talk more about precisely what that means. Just some basic background to this book. We don't know, of course, exactly when it was composed, but for a variety of reasons, we'll place its composition sometime between 200 and 100 BCE, before the Common Era. The extant copies that we have today are in Greek, and you'll see that off to the right side, I put a couple verses from the beginning of the Book of Judith in Greek, so you could read it. It's evidence that I can Google Book of Judith in Greek, the Septuagint, and paste it onto the slide. But that's what the beginning of the book looks like. We actually don't know what the original language of composition was. That is to say, there is one school of thought that says that the Greek text we have in front of us is original. It was written in Greek and copied in Greek, and therefore it's been in Greek all the time. Other people argue, try to make the case that behind the Greek that we have now, there was a Hebrew original, and that our Greek version is simply a translation. Remember that in the years 300 BCE and later, the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire Tanakh, is translated into Greek in Alexandria. And it's possible that along with those books, that books like Judith were also translated into Greek from the original Hebrew. I'm really not in a position to referee the argument, but scholars go back and forth. Some hold that it was Greek from the very beginning. Others hold that it was Hebrew and then Greek. This is a very common argument in the text that we have from this era. I mean, remember that there's a controversy about the book of Matthew in the New Testament, whether or not there is an Aramaic original behind it. And so this is a debate: what language was the book originally written in? And there is a debate about where the book was written. Was it written in Alexandria, among the community of Jews that lived outside of the land of Israel and spoke Greek themselves, or was it written in the land of Israel? Again, people come down onto either side of that issue. The setting of the book, and this is something we also have to be careful about how we talk about, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But the setting on the surface is during the reign of somebody called Nebuchadnezzar of Assyria, who ruled in Nineveh. Now, this is a very curious thing for the book to portend as its setting. Because as students of the Bible, we know that Nebuchadnezzar was never of Assyria. He was of Babylon. And it would be unheard of for a Babylonian king to be ruling in the north in Nineveh, as opposed to be ruling in Bavel. And so this is one of the signs that people take when they analyze the book and they try to figure out what did the authors know or what didn't they know. There's this very strange beginning that Nebuchadnezzar of Assyria. What do I mean when I say that we have to be careful about the setting? Because sometimes the setting that's on the surface is not the true setting of a novel or of a story. The best example of this is the example that's used famously by biblical scholar Gary Rinsberg. He talks about, well, where is the television show MASH set? You could say, well, superficially it's set in the Korean War. I mean, they assert that they're in Korea, that it's in the 1950s. That's what's going on. But that's not the true setting of the series. The true setting of the series, MASH, is in Vietnam. If you look at the attitudes that the soldiers have towards America, towards the military, it's clear that those are not attitudes that existed during the Korean War. So the TV show MASH is about the Vietnam War, but it's set in Korea. We're going to come across the argument that the true setting of the Book of Judith is not in this made-up time of Nebuchadnezzar of Assyria, who ruled in Nineveh, which would put him in the 6th or maybe the 6th or 5th century BCE. But the true setting is the time of the Hasmonean revolt. The true setting is the time of the conflict which we celebrate in the holiday of Hanukkah. And we're going to, as we go through, we'll review the evidence of the connection between this book and that holiday. Since I'm not going to assume that everyone has read this book or that it's known to everyone, we're going to take a few moments and read some sections of it and do a synopsis of the story. First, I want to introduce the picture that's on the right hand. This is Fyodor Shaliapin. I probably did not pronounce that correctly, but this is from the 19th century. And this is from a production of Serov's opera Judith. There's an entire opera about Judith that you can download from Amazon if this class inspires you to at the end. So that's a picture of him. So what's the synopsis of the book? Nebuchadnezzar, so-called, grows haughty with power, and he sends messengers to impose tribute on all the Near East. Well, we can certainly, that did happen more than once. The messengers are shamefully rebuffed. People said, well, we'd rather not pay our taxes to you. So the enraged king sends his general, Holofernes, to pillage, to plunder, and to show that it's very bad form to say no to a powerful Near Eastern monarch. And we'll take up the text in the 3rd chapter. It says, then the kings and the princes of all the cities, the provinces of Syria, Mesopotamia, Syria, Libya, and Sicilia sent their ambassadors, who coming to Holofernes said, let your indignation towards us cease. We didn't mean it. For it is better for us to live and serve Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, and be subject to you, than to die and to perish, or to suffer the misery of slavery. That your fearsome general and your terrible army has made an impression on us. All of our cities and all of our possessions, all mountains, the hills, the fields, the herds of oxen and the flocks of sheep, the camels, all our goods, and all families are in your sight. Do with them as you would. Let all we have be subject to your law. Both we and our children are your servants. Come to us, a peaceable Lord, and use our service as it shall please you. Then when he came down from the mountains with horsemen and great power, and made himself master of every city and all the inhabitants of the land, and from all of the cities he took auxiliaries, valiant men, and chosen for war. And so great a fear lay upon all those provinces, that the inhabitants of all the cities, both princes and nobles, as well as the people, went out to meet him at his coming. And this is very nice. They received him with garlands, with lights, with dances, timbrels, and with flutes. A happy time should have been had by all. But though they did all these things, they could not for all that mitigate the fierceness of his heart. For he both destroyed their cities and he cut down their groves. I'll teach you to surrender. And this is why, in red letters, for Nebuchadnezzar, the king had commanded him to destroy all the gods of the earth, that he only might be called God by those nations, which could be brought under him by the power of Holofernes. And this is one of the clues that we're talking about an era other than the time of Babylonians. I mean, first off, this is a tremendous problem. And we read this set up in Jewish stories many times from antiquity. And, you know, the warlords of antiquity and the ancient Near East, they liked their plunder, they liked their tribute, they wanted people to be subjugated to them. There's not a lot of evidence that as an imperial policy, many Near Eastern kings wanted to be worshipped as a god. This is a famous problem with the Hanukkah story, that according to the story of Hanukkah, Antiochus oppresses the Jews, deprives them of their ability to practice their religion. And this was not the usual manner of operation for the Greek kings. I mean, usually, as I said, if you paid your taxes, if you minded your P's and Q's, everything will be okay. And so when we study the story of Hanukkah, we always get a feeling that there's more to the story, than the Jewish sources are laying on. But this fact that Nebuchadnezzar is being portrayed as somebody who's interested in being worshipped as God by these other nations is a sign that the true setting of the story is not in the ancient time of Babel and Assyria, but is a time, as I said, at the time of the beginnings of the celebration of Hanukkah, at the time of the Hasmoneans. Reading on, then the children of Israel who dwelt in the land of Judah, hearing these things, were exceedingly afraid of him. You should be. He won't let you surrender. Dread and horror seized upon their minds, lest he should do the same to Jerusalem and to the temple of the Lord that he had done to other cities and to their temples. And this is the point where the story changes a little bit from the typical story of pillage and plunder. And the mover here is somebody very interestingly outside the people of Judah, outside the people of Israel. Achior, which is a good Semitic name. My brother is the light. The Ammonite. He confesses the history of Israel before Holofernes. He makes a long, moving speech, and he talks about everything that the children of Israel have been through and how God has saved them, and you better be careful. You don't want to mess with them. And Holofernes, of course, is not very interested to hear this. And he turns Achior over to Israel at the city of Bethulia to die alongside them. And the narrative of Achior, and we'll return to this near the end of the talk, it becomes very significant because the narrative of Achior becomes a narrative of conversion, of a non-Jew becoming Jewish, which is something that's very rare to find in this part of our history. But anyway, the story moves on. You always have to have danger. And Holofernes puts Bethulia to siege. The word Bethulia, first off, we have no idea where the city is. There's nothing on our maps of ancient Israel that says, oh, this is where Bethulia is. There are arguments about where it would need to be archaeologically. For a variety of reasons we're not going to go into. Most people think that this is a Kanui for Shechem, for a city in the north in Samaria. But Bethulia is a play on words. Bethulia means a virginal. And it means a virginal because we're going to meet the heroine of the story, a woman who, after the death of her husband, becomes chaste, and because of her purity and because of her observance, she is going to allow Israel to prevail over Holofernes. And so this is the heroine of the story, Judith. The names here, of course, are not they're not accidental. Just as in the New Testament. I mean, why is the traitor called Judah? Well, he wants to make a point that the Jews are perfidious. But at this point, it's because the hero of it is Judith. She's going to be called for the people, Judith, the Judean woman. Judith has an impressive genealogy. It's recorded all the way back to the time of Shimon or Reuven, depending on your manuscript tradition. Judith is widowed during the barley harvest. It's not as exciting as it sounds. Manassas, he doesn't get run over by a combine. He just has a stroke in the field and he dies. But when Judith confronts the elders of Bethulia, who are ready to make an accommodation, I don't know why it didn't help anyone else, and offers to pray on behalf of the city. And the elders tell her to go ahead and to do that. Judith, she takes off her garments of widowhood and she perfumes herself. She prepares herself in language which is very similar to the preparation of Esther that we read in her book. And just as in the book of Esther, which centers around a great banquet, a great party, Holofernes is taken with Judith, and he invites her to this wonderful party in his tent. And she goes. But it's very interesting. She goes and she says, I can only eat food that I have prepared. In other words, she keeps kosher, and she's not going to eat any of the Assyrian food in its tent. This is one of the early mentions of a character who keeps kosher. I mean, certainly in the I guess the other instance of it this early would be the Book of Daniel, which flows from the same period. Daniel says that he only eats permitted things while he's in captivity. They both eat and they drink, Holofernes and Judith, but Holofernes drinks to excess. And as he's drunk, Judith falls upon him and he cuts off his head. And and you can see in the picture all of these paintings and pictures and statues we see of Judith, she invariably has the head of Holofernes in her hand. And Israel prevails, and Judith remains pure and remains chaste for the rest of her life. She does not marry. She does not take another man. So to talk a bit, that's the synopsis of the book. To talk a bit about the reception of the book. Where do we find this book in our canon, or where do we not find this book in our canon? As I said, this is one of the so-called deuterocanonical texts. Deuterocanonical means second canon. I say so-called because what's the second canon? Who makes it? But that's what we're supposed to call it. So we'll call it the so-called deuterocanonical segment. These are books like Tobit. There are additions to Esther. Remember that many people are queasy about Esther because there's no mention of God. The additions to Esther are very pious. There's God, there's praying, it's very religious. Wisdom of Solomon ben Sirach, which is called Ecclesiastes in Greek. There are additions to Daniel, and Wonder of Wonders, our book of the Maccabees, the story of Hanukkah. These books are extant mostly in Greek. Some of them we have found Hebrew versions of. I mean, for instance, Ben Sirach has a Hebrew version, even though it was mainly preserved in the Greek. They remained in the canon of the Eastern Church, and in many Catholic Bibles you'll have them, but they're in sort of a protected section of the Bible. They're called deuterocanonical. They're off by themselves. They don't have the same status. There's a tradition that these books were excluded from the Jewish canon at the meeting at Yavne. A very part of rabbinic lore is that after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis meet at Yavne to say what's what. And one of the things that they did at Yavne when they said, well, what books are in and what books are out? And they recorded the disputes of what books were in and out in the Mishnah. We know some books were on the edge. Some books were on the jump seat. Yechezkel could have gone in, could have gone out. Esther could have gone in, could have gone out. Shir HaShirim could have gone in, could have gone out. There's no record that Judith was ever considered. But I don't think there's no record that Judith was ever considered. There's no debate among the rabbis. It's not mentioned. It was... These books were fully suppressed in the West in Christian history with the Protestant Reformation. When the Protestants put the Bible into the vernacular, It's an opportunity for them to say what's in, what's out. And these books did not make the cut. So if you buy a standard Protestant Bible, your NIV, your typical Protestant translation of the Bible, these books will not be found. These books will not be found. And you won't find them in a Jewish version of the Bible. If you buy your JPS Tanakh, they're not going to be there. But if you buy a Catholic Bible, you can find them there in their special section. And how they remain there is a story that we will tell a bit about as we move along in this. Even though Judith does not get placed into the canon, there are obvious connections between Judith and the Hebrew Bible. I mean, the most obvious one, and I have the painting by Artemisia Gentileschi on the right side, is the story of Yael and Sisera. Yael is the woman who, in the course of the Song of Deborah, takes Sisera the general to his tent, feeds him a nice meal of milk or cheese, presumably, which is taken by many people to be a sexual innuendo. I don't want to disturb people too much, but that's the people think that that's what the pshat of the text is. But anyway, he's overcome with some sort of satiety. He falls asleep, and Yael takes a peg and drives it through his head and into the ground and kills him. This is an obvious connection to the Book of Judith, the seductive killer who saves the day. And so this is sort of Judith as a charismatic warlord. The Book of Judges is full of those stories, and indeed in the Book of Judith we have the same language, and the land was quiet for 40 years after it stops. I have a little note. This sounds like the story of Yael and Sisera in the Book of Judges. I should read these things more carefully online. Absolutely correct, Barry. Absolutely correct. Good call. Good call. Other connections too, though. We have the righteous widow, which is could be taken as a parallel to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is also a story of conversion, as Achior converts in Judah. Ruth herself becomes a convert. And we also have this idea of the seductive heroine. In Esther, we talk about how she's perfumed, how she's beautiful, how the king can't resist her, and everything's going to be consummated in a great banquet. Of course, it doesn't go as poorly for the king as in Esther, but again, the idea of this beautiful and seductive heroine is something that's common to both to the Book of Judith and to the Book of Esther. So there are many connections between Judith and the Hebrew Bible. It's obviously the person who wrote it was very fluent with the literary themes and is making a commentary, is telling a story by drawing these connections between Judith and these other women that we find in the Bible. Going basically in order, since Judith appears in classical Christianity before she appears in medieval Judaism, we're going to do the sources in classical Christianity first. And very basically, for the church fathers, Judith is considered to be an anticipation of the Virgin Mary. They were very impressed with Judith's chastity, even though she wasn't a virgin for her entire life, which I think is the assumption that Mary was. Even though she was married at first, after she was married, she was chaste forever. But also among these three women, Yael, Judith, and Mary, we have this language for each of them that they are to be blessed among all women. This is explicitly of Yael, who we read of, Baruch Miashim Yael, that may be blessed among women. For Judith, and then said Ozias, who was like the mayor of Bethulia, O daughter, blessed art thou of the Most High God above all women upon the earth. And this is a anticipation of what Luke, in Luke, what the angel is. I should have looked that one up. But in Luke, Mary is giving the blessing, blessed are you among women, and that's contained today in the Hail Mary, Hail Mary full of grace. Blessed are you among women. This connection goes back to something which is called the Proto-Evangelium. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that totally correctly. But so we'll just call it Genesis 3:15 from now on. And so this is a doctrine, there's a doctrine among Christianity that the Gospels are anticipated in the story of the fall from Eve. So God says to the serpent, because you have done this, you will be cursed among all the animals and the beasts of the field. On your belly you will crawl, and dust you will eat for all your life. I will place enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So what does this have to do with the Gospels, with Mary? Well, remember that from the Christian point of view, this story is supposed to be read figuratively as an allegory. And that the serpent is in this allegory, he is Satan, he is sin. And so God is saying to sin, this is what your domain is going to be. But this is also going to be what your end is. I will place enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. In traditional, I think in all Christian theology, this is taken to be a anticipation of Jesus. Uvein zar'ah. It's, when we speak Hebrew, we say very naturally, and her offspring. But the way Hebrew is written, it's in the singular. So if somebody wanted to read this for Christological purposes, not that I'm endorsing that, but you say that this is an anticipation of a singular individual, that is to say, of Jesus. So Jesus will strike the serpent's head, and you will strike his heel. That's a traditional Christian reading of it. But you add to that in Catholic versions of this, going back to Jerome, they read it a little bit differently. They don't read he will crush your head. They read she will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. If you do research into this, as I did, you'll find that there's really no textual basis to read that as she. It's a pretty clear mistake. But, mistakes happen all the time. But you see that once you read that as she, you have that the Mary itself, not the son, the mother will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And in this reading, Judith, when she removes the head from Holofernes, she's an anticipation of Mary, a physical anticipation of the spiritual Mary. Judith physically cuts the head off Holofernes. Mary figuratively crushes the head of sin. And so this is another reason that in the Christian tradition, Judith, think of the irony here, Judith is an anticipation of Mary. Now on to Judith in medieval Judaism. As I said, we go in order. There's no recollection of Judith in the Talmud. When we get to the Middle Ages, the Judith story starts to appear in two really different varieties. The first place it appears is when the late Midrash becomes popular, but when people start to translate the stories of the rabbis into the vernacular. The Talmud, of course, is written in Aramaic, which is great if you live in Bavel or if you're a rabbi. But if you live in Morocco, if you live in Spain, if you live in Northern Europe, there's no reason for you to have any knowledge of Aramaic. So these stories start to be translated into the vernacular. They start to be translated into Judeo-Arabic, and they start to be translated into Hebrew, which people can read a little bit, and into German. The Hebrew and German translations are all quite late that we find, but in the early Middle Ages, we do have translations in Judeo-Arabic. These are mostly freestanding. That is to say that they don't usually use the name Judith. They usually conflate the figures of Nebuchadnezzar and Holofernes, and they don't talk about this imaginary city of Bethulia, but they just center it all on Jerusalem. So these stories start to get out there. It's a popular story of piety about a young woman who stood up for herself and for Judaism and made a difference. In medieval commentaries on the Talmud and in halakhic works, it takes a different turn. The story is still told, and often it's told without recognizing the name of Judith, but the story is told in relation to Hanukkah. Remember, I said the suspicion is that the true setting of the Book of Judith is not in ancient Babylon, but it's the time of the Hasmoneans. And so the rabbis knew these stories, and they recognized the appropriate setting of them, and they applied them halakhically. And so how do we see this? In one case, we see Rashi in Shabbat. Why are women permitted to light Hanukkah candles? I mean, you might think that they would not be permitted to. Usually we have this idea that positive mitzvot that are time-bound, that only men do. I know there are exceptions, but this is why the argument rises in the mind. Why would women be permitted to light Hanukkah candles, which is something that happens at a set time and is a positive commandment? Rashi's answer is that in the time of the Antiochian persecution, in the time that the Greeks were oppressing Israel and the Hasmoneans were revolting, that women were being particularly oppressed by the procedure of droit de seigneur, the right of first try. That is to say that Jewish virgins were being forced to sleep with Greek overlords before they could sleep with their husbands. And Rashi reports that it was a woman, presumably Judith, that rose up, that slew the overlords, and that allowed, and that protected the virginity, protected the chastity of the Jewish women. Obviously, themes and details that are very pertinent and close to the story of Judith. The Ran on the Rif in the same place. Why do we eat cheese on Hanukkah? Apparently there was this great custom of eating cheese on Hanukkah. People wanted to know what it was. And he says it's because that cheese was something that Judith used to paralyze, to satiate Holofernes before she could kill him. This is interesting because this is not necessarily a detail from the Book of Judith. It does mention cheese, but cheese is just one of the few foods that she uses. I'm sure that the emphasis on cheese goes back to the story of Judges and to Yael. Anyway, so this is the way that the Ran on the Rif ties it to Hanukkah. So over on the right side, I have, and we are having a craft sale at Beth Israel this weekend. I don't think this menorah is going to be on sale, but this is a Judith menorah. And you can see the place for the candles at the bottom. And you can see on top there's a sculpture of Judith with her knife and the head of Holy Furnace in her hand. This is from the 19th century in Italy. Every house should have one of these. Think of the conversations you could have with your children about the true meaning of Hanukkah. But anyway, by the Middle Ages, we have both the distribution among Jews of the popular story of a young woman who, in the time of persecution, rises up and saves the day. We also have this identification with Hanukkah and the stories and the values that are spoken of in the Book of Judith. I wanted to close with a couple of other slides to just give you the taste for all of the stuff that is out there in Judith studies. And Judith studies is actually its own field, and it's really this is a great time to be alive if you're into Jewish studies. But all of these things that you can look at, and at the end of the talk, I'll show you the book that I've been reading, and you can check it out too, that if you're interested, because there's a whole history of sort of Judith through the ages, starting with our stories in the Bible, going through a classic Christian period, a medieval Jewish period, but also in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, there's a great tradition of Judith sculptures and paintings, but Judith is secularized. She doesn't represent Judean purity. I mean, there's be no reason for a Renaissance artist to be worried about that. But she is invoked as the enemy of tyranny and the vindicator of the oppressed. And over here is a picture of the statue of Donatello's Judith and Holofernes. And the scholars believe that the inscription on it was kingdoms fall through luxury, cities rise through virtue, good Renaissance values. And again, when I show you the sources at the end, if you want, you can look through all of the great art that was created with Judith as its object in the Renaissance. Even more here. This is a Renaissance era, Reformation era painting of Judith. Again, she's always with the head of Holy Furnace. You can't do Judith without the head. But she looks very German there. Look, she has gloves on. She has a nice medieval sword, a nice hat. She looks like she lives in a northern latitude there. Again, it's the detachment of Judith from any sort of Judean or even sort of a Christian requirement, and as a symbol of somebody who stands up to the big guy, a David versus Goliath, a freedom versus tyranny kind of position. Judith becomes very, so that last one was this one is the Reformation era Judah. What's good for the goose is sauce for the gander. That Catholics were not, they didn't stand by. They didn't stand by and let Judith be held by the Renaissance types and by the Protestants. And in the Counter-Reformation, in the Baroque period, Judith becomes a symbol of the church, triumphant against Protestant heresy. Just as you can think of it, just as Mary crushed the serpent's head, so Judith was crushing the Protestant rebellion. She was the perfect symbol for this. I mean, the great item of dispute between the Catholics and the Protestants was the Marian theology of the Catholics. And Judith, as we've pointed out, was the great anticipation of Mary, and so that she could be used very easily as a symbol for this. They have this slogan, from Eva to Ave, from Eve to Ave. Also because the Protestants took Judith out of the canon, she was also, for that reason, she was very useful as a symbol of what was being left behind when the Bible went into the vernacular, when the Greek and Latin culture was left on the shelf. And finally, of course, we have Judith in modernity. The picture here on the right is Judith 1 by Klimt. And Judith becomes an important figure in feminist interpretations of Judaism. One reading that I have with the top, you can tell that the modern portrayals of Judith, because they tend to be highly sexualized. I mean, this is a very sexual painting there. I hope we don't lose our family-friendly rating on YouTube. But the one feminist reading of it from the Jewish point of view, it emphasizes indeed Judith's sensuality and her corporality. That's to say, the Christians made Judith sort of a heavenly, chaste being, sort of ethereal. The Jewish readings, when they try to own it, they point out that, well, this is, what did she bring into this? She brought food and earthy stuff. And they say that just as Jews are a corporal people, we're a carnal people, as opposed to Christians who are a heavenly people, our Judith is a sensual, corporal Judith, as opposed to the heavenly Judith that has been advanced by Christianity. Another interesting feminist perspective contrasts Judith, who's the biblical outsider, with Esther, who's the biblical insider. I mean, what that means is that Esther got in the Bible, and Judith was left out. And the point is made. The point is made that the character of Esther is much more friendly to patriarchy than the portrait of Judith. I mean, Judith was chaste. Esther was a concubine. I mean, she was a useful concubine for the Jewish people. But the figure of Esther is not necessarily all that threatening. She's the good wife in contrast to Vashti's bad wife. She accomplishes what she wants to accomplish by pleasing men. It's not threatening at all. Judith accomplishes what she wants to accomplish by cutting the head off of men. That's very threatening. And the reading then is that Judith is the feminist model. She's the outsider. She's left out of the male Bible because what she does offends patriarchy. Whereas Esther, who otherwise seems to be very similar, is permitted because she's very patriarchy friendly. Let's put it that way. Some final thoughts, and I know that I've been talking for more than I usually do for these classes. My rule is usually to turn into a pumpkin by 45 minutes. So I owe you a few minutes. But some final thoughts on Judith and Hanukkah. One of the real ironies of this story is that even though Judith is incorporated into Judaism medievally as part of the Hanukkah lore, Hanukkah is the time when we celebrate our resistance to foreign influences. Even though this is the case, the actual historical import of the Book of Judith is really testimony to how Judaism was becoming Hellenized. And that's seen in the figure of Achior. Part of what was threatening about Hellenization to Jews was that it was not that Jews were going to become ethnically Greek, but that Jews were going to become philosophically Greek. And in order to fight that, Judaism itself had to become a philosophical religion. It had to become a worldview and not just an ethnicity. And the fact that Achior is shown as becoming a Jew, not necessarily becoming an ethnic Jew, but becoming a Jew by sharing the worldview, and this is really the most remarkable thing about the book in terms of the quote history of ideas unquote. So it's sort of ironic that even though this book is used, the story is used in the service of Hanukkah. The true importance is probably that shows how Hellenism forced Judaism to become Greek-like in order to survive. I think that's very interesting. Finally, and on the right is the book that I've been studying to bring you these materials, The Sword of Judith, and I would recommend anyone who's interested to read it. I bought an old Dead Tree copy, but it's on the internet for free if you want to look at it. Just Google it. But I'm impressed by how tentative canonization is. I mean, the rabbis were emphatic that the Book of Judith was going to be on the outside. Later, the Protestants were emphatic that the Book of Judith should be on the outside. But the people who really canonize aren't the rabbis and the ministers. What creates a canon in the end is the reception. If people like a story, if people like a vision, if people like a character, that character is always going to be incorporated. That character is always going to be used. And the fact that Judith, despite never making it into the canon, has such an influence on the Western religious imagination just reminds us how tentative canonization is. And with that, I'll conclude. Again, I'll make my plea again to stop into the Facebook page and give me a like. Every like helps. Every like helps. And I will remain on the air for a few moments to answer any questions. If there's no questions, I'll wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. Hope everyone stays warm. Good night, everyone.